Rachel Anderson had been flying the desert routes for 3 months now, every weekend without fail. The rebuilt A-10 Warthog beneath her responded like an old friend, heavy, reliable, and utterly dependable in ways the sleek modern fighters could never match. She'd spent 4 years restoring this particular aircraft, tail number 880,914, working nights in her garage after her day job at the aerospace engineering firm. The morning sun painted the Nevada landscape in shades of copper and gold as Rachel adjusted her heading slightly. She wasn't supposed to be thinking about anything but the flight controls, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. "You know your father never wanted you flying that thing," her mother had said, voice tight with old worry. "He said some aircraft carried too much history." Rachel had laughed it off, but sitting in the cockpit now, surrounded by the analog gauges and worn controls her father had once touched, she understood what he'd meant. Every switch, every lever seemed to whisper stories she'd never heard him tell. The radio crackled to life, jolting her back to the present. "Unidentified aircraft, you are entering restricted training airspace. Change heading immediately." Rachel blinked, checking her sectional chart. She was close to the boundary, but not inside it at least. She didn't think so. The desert landscape all looked the same from up here. Endless ridges and valleys that could shift your perception without warning. "Civilian aircraft November 3814 Charlie," she responded, voice steady. "I am correcting course now and request permission to exit zone at heading 220. The pause that followed felt longer than it should have. When the voice came back, it was different, colder, more official. "Negative, November 3814 Charlie. You are in breach of restricted airspace protocol. Hold current position. You will be escorted to base perimeter. Comply immediately." Rachel's hands tightened slightly on the controls. She knew she hadn't crossed into restricted space, but arguing with air traffic control rarely ended well for civilian pilots. 2 silver dots appeared in her peripheral vision, growing rapidly larger F-16s, sleek and predatory, cutting through the morning air like arrows seeking a target. The lead F-16 pilot's voice crackled through her headset, young and dismissive. "Ma'am, you flying that brick on purpose? This your first time in military airspace, or just sightseeing?" His wingman chimed in with barely concealed laughter. "Somebody get a museum crew on standby. This relic's about to scratch the paint off our grid." Rachel didn't respond. There was no point. She'd heard it all before, every joke about the A-10's ungainly appearance, every comment about flying obsolete aircraft. Let them laugh. The Warthog had been proving doubters wrong for decades. "Visual confirms it's an A-10, the first pilot continued, his tone shifting to routine professionalism. "Old frame, odd markings. Looks like civilian modification, probably. A custom rebuild. She's way off chart. Copy that. Treat as low-risk civilian incursion. We'll walk her to the fence." Rachel watched one of the fighters position itself off her left wing, its polished surface gleaming like jewelry against the desert sky. The contrast was almost comical. Her aircraft bore sun-dulled skin, soft lines of patch welds, and hand-labeled panels that told the story of every repair she'd made. But it held together. It always had. "Nice tail number, ma'am," came the voice again, slightly mocking. "Can't tell if it's original or just meant to look vintage. That a tribute plane or something?" Still, Rachel said nothing. The silence seemed to unsettle them more than any defense would have. She adjusted her heading slightly, the Warthog responding, with its characteristic heavy grace, and continued flying the escort pattern they'd imposed on her. What none of them knew, what Rachel herself was only beginning to understand, was that the tail number stenciled in faded black above her left wing was about to change everything. 880,914 wasn't just a random sequence of digits. It was a piece of history that had been sleeping for 25 years, waiting for the right moment to wake up. In the base control tower, a radar technician was frowning at his screen. A blue overlay had appeared where there should have been red, a signal he'd never seen before, transmitted through hardware authentication he didn't understand. The aircraft's transponder was responding to something buried deep in the military's database, something that made the system flag the flight not as a threat, but as something else entirely. The technician called for his supervisor, pointing at the anomaly. Within minutes, the alert would work its way up the chain of command, reaching people who remembered what that tail number meant. People who had been waiting 25 years for it to return to the sky. But for now, Rachel flew on, bracketed by fighters whose pilots had no idea they were escorting legend back home. The silence on the radio stretched longer than it should have. Rachel could feel the tension building in the formation around her. The F-16s had tightened their positions, and she sensed a shift in their attitude even before anyone spoke. Below them, the desert had opened into the familiar training ranges where her father used to practice low-altitude runs. She recognized the terrain from old photographs he'd kept in his flight case, black and white images of canyons and ridges that looked like scars across the earth. Tower, confirmed tail number on target aircraft, came the voice of the lead F-16 pilot, and something in his tone had changed. The casual mockery was gone, replaced by something Rachel couldn't quite identify. Tail confirmed 880,914. Repeat, 880,914. The silence that followed was different from before. It felt heavy, loaded with significance Rachel didn't understand. Then the pilot's voice came back, cracked and uncertain. Control, I request immediate status hold on this flight. Cancel all aggressive protocol. We are escorting an aircraft tied to protocol roar. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had heard that name exactly once in her life, whispered by her father during a nightmare that had woken the whole house when she was 12. He'd never explained it, never spoken of it again, but the way he'd said it had burned itself into her memory. Say again, lead, came the wingman's confused response. It's canyon hold, the first pilot whispered, his voice barely audible over the radio. That's the tail. That's the bird. In the back seat of the second F-16, a weapons systems officer was frantically pulling up historical databases, his fingers trembling as he typed. When the results appeared on his screen, he went completely still. Jesus, he muttered. She's flying it. It's really here. Rachel's hands remained steady on the controls, but her mind was racing. Canyon hold, she'd never heard that term before, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered song. The Warthog seemed to sense her confusion, responding to her inputs with the same patient reliability it always had. The first pilot's voice returned, formal now, respectful in a way that made Rachel's spine straighten. Tower, do we have identity? On the operator? Name coming through. Registered pilot is Rachel Anderson. Civilian restoration authorization. No other log entries. Another pause then. Anderson. As in Major David Anderson? Rachel's heart stopped. Her father's name, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the dead. But he wasn't dead. He was very much alive, living quietly in Phoenix, working as a flight instructor and pretending his military service had been unremarkable. Tower, I need confirmation on relation. The pilot pressed. Stand by. A longer pause, filled with the sound of keyboards clicking and databases being searched. Confirmed. Rachel Anderson, daughter of retired Major David Anderson, calcined monarch. The radio went completely silent. Rachel could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the pilots around her. Monarch, another name she'd never heard, but one that seemed to carry weight she was only beginning to understand. The lead F-16 pilot's voice, when it finally returned, was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, are you aware of what aircraft you're flying?" Rachel found her voice, though it came out steadier than she felt. "It's my father's A-10. I restored it." "Your father's?" The pilot trailed off, then keyed his mic again. "Ma'am, that's not just any A-10. That's the Canyon Hole bird. That's the aircraft that wrote the manual on impossible rescue missions." In the base control tower, Colonel Jennifer Hayes was reading a classified file she hadn't opened in 15 years. Her hand shook slightly as she turned the pages, seeing again the mission reports, the casualty lists, the impossible mathematics of what Major David Anderson had accomplished in that canyon 25 years ago. She had been a junior officer, then part of a recon team that had been written off as lost. The canyon was too narrow, the enemy positions too well fortified, the weather conditions impossible. Every conventional rescue option had been ruled out as suicide. But David Anderson hadn't been flying a conventional aircraft, and he hadn't been thinking conventionally. He had taken his A-10 into terrain that helicopters couldn't navigate, flying at speeds that seemed impossible for an aircraft of its size, weaving between canyon walls with precision that defied every safety manual ever written. 6 pilots had been extracted that day. 6 lives saved by one man's refusal to accept that impossible meant impossible. The mission had been classified immediately, the story buried in files that most people would never see. But the aircraft had become legend among those who knew. Protocol, raw named for the extraction technique Anderson had pioneered, had been written into the manual as the last resort option for terrain-restricted rescues. The A-10 with tail number 880,914 had become the aircraft every pilot measured themselves against, even though most of them would never know its real story. And now it was back, flown by the daughter of the man who had made it famous. Colonel Hayes picked up her headset and keyed into the frequency. Her voice, when she spoke, carried 25 years of respect and memory. "Pilot of tail number 880,914, this is Colonel Jennifer Hayes, Base Commander." "Confirm name." Rachel's response came clear and steady. "This is Rachel Anderson, civilian pilot. I'm the daughter of Major David Anderson." Hayes closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the sound of A-10 engines echoing through a canyon, remembering the moment she realized she was going to live after all. "You have full clearance, Rachel. Proceed on any heading you wish. Welcome home." The escort formation had changed completely. Where there had been containment, there was now something approaching ceremony. The F-16s flew wider, their positions respectful rather than controlling, and a third aircraft had joined them, an older pilot who had listened to the radio chatter and chosen to participate in what was becoming less of an intercept and more of a homecoming. Rachel flew steady through it all, but inside the cockpit, her world was reeling. The names being spoken over the radio monarch, Canyon Hold, Protocol Roar, were pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life without knowing. Her father had always been different from other dads. Quieter, more careful with his words, quick to deflect questions about his military service. When she'd asked about the A-10 in their garage, covered by a tarp and seemingly forgotten, he'd simply said it was a project for someday. When she'd started the restoration work, he'd helped without comment, his hands knowing every wire and bolt, as if they'd never forgotten. But he'd never explained why his fingers sometimes trembled when he touched certain controls. He'd never told her why he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, muttering coordinates under his breath. And he'd never, ever spoken the word monarch in her presence. "Rachel," came Colonel Hayes' voice again, cutting through her thoughts. "I'm going to ask you to land at our base. There are some people who would like to meet you, and some things you should probably know about that aircraft." Rachel hesitated. She had planned to fly the morning pattern and head home. maybe grab lunch with her mother, spend the afternoon reading in her garden. A simple Saturday that was rapidly becoming anything but simple. "Colonel, I'm not sure I understand what's happening here." "I know you don't," Hayes replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But that tail number ... means something. Your father never told you about Canyon Hold, did he?" "No, ma'am. He never told me about any of it." There was a pause, filled with the steady hum of the Warthog's engines and the whisper of wind over the canopy. Then Hayes spoke again, and her voice carried the weight of old promises and older debts. "He saved my life, Rachel, along with 5 other pilots. We were trapped in a canyon, no way out, enemy positions on every ridge. Every rescue option had been ruled out as impossible. Your father flew that aircraft into hell and brought us all home." Rachel's hands tightened on the controls. She thought about her father's nightmares, his quiet intensity, the way he sometimes stared at the desert horizon as if he were seeing something she couldn't. "The mission was classified," Hayes continued. "Most of the details still are. But the technique. He pioneered flying low-altitude rescue missions in impossible terrain. It saved dozens of lives over the years. We called it Protocol Roar after his call sign. That protocol is still active. It's still saving people." The F-16 pilot, who had first recognized the tail number, keyed his mic, his voice subdued. "Ma'am, I studied Canyon Hold in flight school. I just ... I never thought I'd see the actual aircraft. Most of us figured it was just a story." "It's not a story," Rachel said quietly. "It's sitting in my garage for 4 years while I rebuilt the engines." She thought about all those nights in the garage, her father working beside her in comfortable silence, his hands sure and quick on components she was still learning. She thought about the time she'd caught him staring at the tail number, 880,914, as if it were a name he was trying not to remember. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Hayes' voice was soft when she answered. "Because he's a good man who did an impossible thing, and good. Men don't usually talk about their impossible things. They just do them when they have to, then try to forget." The base was visible now, a collection of buildings and runways spread across the desert floor like a small city. Rachel could see people gathering along the flight line, not just ground crew, but dozens of personnel who had stopped what they were doing to watch the approach of an aircraft most of them had never expected to see. "Tower, this is Anderson," Rachel said, using her call sign for the first time in the context of her father's legacy. "Requesting permission to land. Granted, Anderson. Runway 26 is clear. Priority approach authorized." As she began her descent, Rachel caught sight of something that made her breath catch. There, along the edge of the runway, stood a small group of older officers. Even from this distance, she could see the way they held themselves, the posture of people who had been waiting for something and who had finally seen it return. The Warthog touched down with its characteristic solid thump, the landing gear, absorbing the impact with mechanical precision. As she taxied toward the designated packing area, Rachel could see more people gathering: pilots, ground crew, support staff, and others she couldn't identify. They weren't cheering or waving. They stood at respectful attention, some with their hands over their hearts, others simply watching in silence. When she finally shut down the engines and the familiar whine wound down to silence, Rachel sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. The tail number 880,914 was just paint and stencil, but somehow it had become a key that unlocked doors she'd never known existed. She removed her helmet, opened the canopy, and climbed down onto the tarmac. The desert air was warm and still, and in the distance she could hear the sound of other aircraft taking off and landing, the routine business of a military base going about its day. But here, on this particular patch of concrete, time seemed to have folded in on itself. The past and present were standing side by side, waiting to see what would happen next. Colonel Hayes approached first, her uniform crisp, but her eyes soft with something that might have been tears. "Welcome to Nellis, Rachel," she said. "I think it's time you learned the rest of your father's story." The briefing room was smaller than Rachel had expected, windowless and sterile, with fluorescent lights that hummed quietly overhead. But the people who filed in were anything but ordinary. Colonel Hayes had assembled what she called the Canyon Hold survivors, 6 pilots who had been extracted from an impossible situation 25 years earlier. All of whom were now senior officers stationed at Nellis or nearby bases. They entered quietly, each taking a seat at the long conference table with the careful movements of people who had learned to respect moments of significance. Rachel sat at the head of the table, feeling simultaneously honored and overwhelmed by the attention. "Before we begin," Colonel Hayes said, settling into her chair, "I want you to understand that what we're about to discuss is still classified at the highest levels. The details of Canyon Hold are known to fewer than 50 people in the entire Air Force. Your presence here, flying that aircraft, changes some things, but not others." Rachel nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like the desert heat outside, inescapable and transformative. Major Robert Chun, one of the younger officers present, leaned forward. "Ma'am, if I may ask, did your father ever mention anything about the mission?" "Any details at all?" "Nothing," Rachel replied. "He barely talked about his military service at all. I knew he'd flown at 10s, obviously, but he made it sound like routine training flights and standard deployments. Nothing special." A few of the officers exchanged glances. Colonel Hayes pulled out a thick folder, classified markings visible along its edges. "Your father was assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron in 1999, she began. "Standard rotation, standard missions, until October 15th, 2000. That's when everything changed." She opened the folder, revealing aerial photographs of terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet, deep canyons carved into red rock, narrow passages that seemed barely wide enough for a hiking trail, much less an aircraft. "We were conducting a reconnaissance mission in disputed territory," Hayes continued. 6 aircraft, routine intelligence gathering. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly, and we found ourselves flying in zero visibility through terrain that was challenging. Major Patricia Wells, a graying woman with pilot's wings on her uniform, spoke up. "Challenging is putting it mildly. We were flying through a maze with no map, in weather that kept getting worse by the minute. The mission went bad fast," added Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, his voice rough with old memory. "Surface-to-air missiles started coming up from positions we didn't know existed. We lost radar contact with base. Communication was intermittent at best, and the weather had us boxed in." Hayes pulled out another photograph, this one showing the wreckage of aircraft scattered across canyon floors. 5 of the 6 planes went down within minutes of each other. Engine failures, missile strikes, controlled crashes. By some miracle, all 6 pilots survived the initial impacts, but we were scattered across roughly 30 square miles of canyon system, some of us injured, all of us trapped. Rachel studied the photographs, trying to imagine her father receiving news of the disaster, trying to picture him making the decision that would define the rest of his career. "The rescue attempts began immediately," Hayes continued. "Helicopters couldn't get low enough because of the terrain and ongoing hostile fire. Fast movers couldn't slow down enough to provide meaningful support. Ground teams would have taken days to reach us, assuming they could navigate the canyon system at all. We were written off," Chun said bluntly. "Command made the call that extraction was impossible under current conditions. They were going to wait for weather to clear and mount a ground recovery operation. That could have been days, Wells added. We had limited water, some injuries, and no guarantee the hostile forces wouldn't find us first. Hayes turned to a new page in the folder, revealing a technical diagram of an A-10 with flight path vectors drawn in red ink across the canyon system. The paths looked like spaghetti impossibly complex, with turns and descents that seemed to defy physics. Your father volunteered for what the manual would have classified as a suicide mission, she said quietly. Solo flight, no backup, no rescue plan if he went down. The terrain required flight profiles that were outside normal safety parameters. The weather conditions were marginal at best. The enemy presence was confirmed and active. Rachel stared at the diagram, tracing the flight paths with her eyes. She had flown the A-10 enough to understand what the vectors represented: turns that would stress the airframe to its limits, descents that left no room for error, navigation that required split-second timing and perfect spatial awareness. He said yes anyway, Thompson continued. Just looked at the aerial photos, studied the weather reports, and said he'd go get us. The flight took him 4 hours, Hayes said. 4 hours of flying through terrain that should have been impossible. To navigate, using techniques that hadn't been invented yet, improvising solutions to problems that had never been solved before. She pulled out the final photograph: 6 pilots standing beside an A-10 on a desert tarmac, all of them looking exhausted but alive. At the center of the group stood a man Rachel barely recognized as her father younger, thinner, with an expression of quiet intensity she had never seen on his face. He found all 6 of us, Wells said, her voice thick with emotion. Some of us were unconscious, some injured, all of us in locations that required precision flying that ... Well, that shouldn't have been possible. The extraction technique he pioneered that day became Protocol ROAR, Hayes explained. Low-altitude terrain following, precision cargo drops, improvised landing zones in impossible locations. It's been used successfully 37 times since then, saving over 200 lives. Rachel sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Her quiet father, who taught flying lessons and worked on aircraft, engines, and never spoke about his military service, had literally rewritten the book on combat rescue operations. Why was it classified? She asked. Because the techniques were too valuable to publicize, Hayes replied. And because your father requested it. He didn't want the attention. He just wanted to make sure the knowledge was preserved so it could be used again if needed. The room fell silent for a moment, filled with the weight of heroism that had been kept secret for 25 years. Finally, Rachel spoke. He's going to be so angry that you told me all this. Hayes smiled for the first time since the briefing began. Actually, Rachel, we think he's going to be proud. Because there's something else we need to discuss. Colonel. Hayes waited until the other officers had left the briefing room before pulling out a second folder. This one marked with current, date stamps, and urgent classification headers. Rachel remained seated, still processing everything she'd learned about her father's hidden heroism. Rachel, I'm about to ask something of you that I have no right to ask, Hayes began, her voice taking on the weight of command authority mixed with personal request. But circumstances have developed that make your presence here more than just coincidental. She opened the new folder, revealing satellite imagery of rugged terrain that looked disturbingly similar to the canyon hold photographs. But these were recent. The timestamps showed they'd been taken less than 48 hours ago. Yesterday morning, a search and rescue training exercise went wrong in the Panamint Range, about 200 miles northeast of here. A team of 4 rescue specialists were practicing high-altitude extraction techniques when their helicopter experienced mechanical failure. Rachel leaned forward, studying the images. The terrain was brutal deep gorges carved between towering rock faces, with landing zones that looked barely large enough for a person, much less an aircraft. The helicopter crew managed a controlled crash landing, but they're stuck in a location that's proving almost impossible to reach. Ground teams can't navigate the approach route safely. Helicopter rescue is complicated by the altitude and wind conditions in the gorge. Weather reports show another storm system moving in within the next 18 hours. Hayes pulled out. Tactical assessment chart covered in red marks and exclusion zones. We've run the scenario through our planning computers. Every conventional rescue option shows unacceptable risk levels or timeline constraints that put the crew in jeopardy. Rachel felt her stomach tighten as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. The only viable extraction profile matches protocol ROAR parameters, Hayes continued. Low-altitude canyon navigation, precision payload delivery, improvised landing zone utilization. The kind of mission that requires an A-10 and a pilot who understands the specific techniques your father pioneered. You want me to fly a rescue mission, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. I want to give you the choice, Hayes corrected. We have other A-10 pilots on base, some with extensive combat experience, but none of them have the specific training in your father's techniques. And none of them are flying the aircraft that wrote the original protocol. She pulled out another document: mission parameters, weather forecasts, terrain analysis, and risk assessments. The scope of it was staggering, but the core problem was elegantly simple. 4 people were going to die unless someone could do something that had only been done once before, 25 years ago. The aircraft is mission ready, Hayes continued. We've had our best technicians go over it since you landed. Everything checks out perfectly. Your restoration work is actually superior to original military specifications in several key areas. Rachel thought about her father, working beside her in the garage night after night, his hands sure and patient as they rebuilt systems and calibrated instruments. Had he known somehow that this moment might come? Had he been preparing the aircraft and her for exactly this kind of situation? What does my father think about this? She asked. Hayes smiled grimly. We haven't told him yet. Protocol requires that we ask the pilot first, then notify next of kin if the pilot accepts the mission. And if I say no, then we try conventional approaches and hope for the best. No one would blame you, Rachel. This isn't your responsibility. You're a civilian pilot who restored an aircraft as a hobby project. You don't owe the Air Force anything. But even as Hayes spoke the words, they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The aircraft beneath them carried more than just metal and fuel. It carried a legacy of impossible rescues and the memory of a man who had said yes when everyone else said no. Rachel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the tarmac, where her father's A-10 sat surrounded by modern fighters. It looked anachronistic, a relic from another era of aviation. But she knew, now, what it was really capable of. She knew what it had been built to do. I need to know something, she said, turning back to Hayes. If I do this, if I attempt this mission, am I doing it because I'm qualified or because I'm David Anderson's daughter? Hayes met her gaze directly. Both, she said without hesitation. You're qualified because you've spent 4 years learning every system on that aircraft, because you've logged more flight hours in A-10s than any civilian pilot on record, and because you've been unconsciously trained by the man who invented the techniques we need. You're chosen because you're his daughter and you're flying his plane, and sometimes legacy matters more than protocol. Rachel walked back to the table and picked up the mission folder, flipping through pages of technical data and aerial reconnaissance photos. 4 people were sitting in a canyon, waiting for help that might never come, unless she was willing to attempt something that existed at the very edge of possibility. She thought about her father's nightmares, the ones that had haunted him for 25 years. She thought about the weight he had carried silently, the heroism he had never spoken about, the techniques he had pioneered and then tried to forget. "When do we launch?" she asked. Hayes smiled, but her expression remained serious. "As soon as you're ready. Weather window closes in 14 hours. After that, the storm system makes any rescue attempt impossible for at least a week." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of decision settle into her bones like desert heat. She was about to attempt something that only one person in history had ever successfully completed: flying an aircraft that carried the memory of miracles, trying to prove that heroism could be inherited along with everything else. "I'm ready now," she said. "Let's go save some lives." The pre-dawn darkness over Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with controlled urgency. Rachel sat in the A-10's cockpit, running through her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision her father had drilled into her during countless hours of training. But this wasn't training anymore. Somewhere in the Panamint Range, 4 airmen were waiting for a miracle that might never come. Colonel Hayes stood beside the aircraft, headset in hand, coordinating the final mission parameters. "Weather update. Shows you've got maybe 6 hours before the storm front reaches the target area," she called up to Rachel. "Wind conditions in the canyon are marginal but manageable. Visibility is good for now." Rachel nodded, her hands moving across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface responded exactly as it should. The restoration had been perfect. The aircraft was actually in better condition now than it had been during her father's original canyon hold mission. "Medical team is standing by at the improvised landing zone coordinates," Hayes continued. "We've got ground crews positioned at 3 possible emergency landing sites along your route. SAR helicopters are on standby at the canyon rim, ready to assist if needed." But they both knew that if the mission failed, there wouldn't be much anyone could do to help. The terrain was too unforgiving, the margins too narrow. The radio crackled. "To life. Anderson, this is Phoenix Base. We have your father on the line." Rachel's heart skipped. She hadn't expected this, hadn't known they'd contacted him until the mission was already underway. "Put him through," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. There was a pause. Then the familiar voice came through the headset, calm and measured despite the circumstances. "Rachel, hi, Dad. I understand you're about to do something extraordinarily stupid and dangerous." Despite everything, Rachel smiled. "I learned from the best." "You learned aircraft restoration from me," David Anderson replied. "Nobody taught. You had to fly into canyons that want to kill you. That's something you figure out as you go. Any advice?" The pause stretched longer than usual. When her father spoke again, his voice carried 25 years of memory and hard-won wisdom. "Trust the aircraft. Trust your instruments. But mostly, trust your hands. When the terrain gets complicated and the wind starts playing games with you, don't think too much. Just fly. The plane knows what it's supposed to do. You just have to let it do it." "Dad? Yeah? Were you scared? During canyon hold?" Another pause. "Terrified," he admitted. "Every second from takeoff to landing. Fear keeps you alive in situations like this. Don't try to ignore it, use it." The tower controller's voice cut in. "Anderson, you are cleared for immediate departure. Winds are favorable. Visibility is good. Safe flight." Rachel keyed her mic for the last time before launch. "Love you, Dad. Bring them home, sweetheart, and then bring yourself home." The A-10 rolled onto the runway, its twin engines spooling up to full power with a sound like controlled thunder. Rachel released the brakes and felt the familiar push of acceleration as the aircraft gathered speed. The nose lifted, the landing gear retracted, and suddenly she was airborne, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness with 4 lives depending on her ability to do something that had only been done once before. The flight to the Panamint Range took 43 minutes time. Rachel spent running through mental rehearsals of the canyon approach while monitoring weather conditions and fuel consumption. The satellite communication system kept her connected to base operations, providing real-time updates on the stranded crew's condition and any changes in environmental factors. Phoenix Base. This is Anderson. She called as the first ridges of the target area came into view. I have visual on the outer canyon system. Beginning descent to survey altitude. Copy, Anderson. Crew reports they can hear aircraft engines. Their beacon is active, and they're ready for supply drop if needed. Rachel descended to 500 feet above the canyon rim, beginning her reconnaissance pass. The gorge below was even more challenging than the satellite photos had suggested. A narrow slash in the earth that twisted and turned like a snake, with walls that rose nearly vertical on both sides. The helicopter crew had managed to crash land on a tiny ledge about 2/3 of the way down, but reaching them would require precision flying that left no room for error. She made 3 passes over the area, studying the terrain, noting wind patterns and potential approach vectors. The space was tight, barely wide enough for the A-10's wingspan in some sections, and the landing zone was smaller than a tennis court. Phoenix Base, Anderson. I've completed reconnaissance. Beginning approach sequence. Roger, Anderson. All support elements are standing by. You are cleared to proceed at your discretion. Rachel banked the A-10 into the canyon mouth, feeling the wind patterns change as the aircraft entered the confined space. The walls rose around her like the throat of some enormous beast, and she could hear her father's voice in her memory. Trust the aircraft. Trust your instruments. Trust your hands. The Warthog responded to her inputs with mechanical precision. Each control movement translated instantly into changes in altitude and direction. She descended in a controlled spiral, following the canyon's natural curves, her eyes constantly shifting between the terrain ahead and the instruments that would tell her if she was pushing the aircraft beyond its limits. Halfway down, she caught sight of the crashed helicopter, a twisted mass of metal and rotor blades perched precariously on a ledge that looked impossibly small from above. 4 figures waved from beside the wreckage, their survival gear bright orange against the gray rock. Phoenix Base. I have visual on the crew. They appear to be mobile and responsive. Beginning supply drop sequence. Rachel lined up the A-10 for a precision drop, opening the cargo bay doors and releasing emergency supplies that would land within 20 feet of the stranded airmen. Medical kit, water, communication equipment, and emergency flares tumbled toward the ledge in a carefully calculated trajectory. Drop successful, she reported, watching the packages land exactly where intended. Crew is retrieving supplies now. But the supply drop was just the first phase. The real challenge lay ahead somehow. Getting those 4 people out of a location that seemed designed to trap anything that entered it. Rachel climbed back out of the canyon, circling while she studied the approach vectors one more time. The margin for error was essentially 0. Too fast, and she'd overshoot the tiny landing zone and crash into the canyon wall. Too slow, and the aircraft would lose lift in the confined space and drop like a stone. She thought about her father attempting this same kind of impossible navigation 25 years earlier. Had he felt this same mixture of terror and determination? Had he questioned his sanity right up until the moment he committed to the approach? Phoenix Base, Anderson. Beginning extraction approach. Copy, Anderson. Medical team confirms all. 4 crew members are ambulatory. They're ready for immediate evacuation. Rachel banked the A-10 into the canyon mouth for the second time, but this approach was different. Lower, slower, with the absolute precision required to thread the needle between disaster and miracle. The aircraft descended through air that seemed to grow thicker with each foot of altitude lost, following a flight path that existed only in her mind and in the muscle memory inherited from her father. The canyon walls closed in around her, and for a moment she understood viscerally why this kind of mission had only been attempted once before. The space was impossibly tight, the margins impossibly small, the consequences of failure impossibly final. But the A-10 flew steady and true, responding to her inputs with the same mechanical precision that had carried her father through Canyon Hold. The aircraft seemed to know what was expected of it, each control movement flowing naturally into the next as they descended toward the tiny ledge where 4 lives hung in the balance. At the bottom of the canyon, with walls rising like skyscrapers on both sides, Rachel Anderson proved that heroism could indeed be inherited. The Warthog touched down on the impossibly small ledge with a precision that would have made her father proud, completing the second successful Protocol Roar extraction in Air Force history. As the rescued crew climbed aboard and the aircraft lifted off from the canyon floor, Rachel knew that she had done more than save 4 lives. She had honored a legacy, continued a tradition, and proven that some aircraft and some pilots are built for the impossible. The extraction from the canyon had been flawless. 4 airmen safely recovered. No injuries, no damage to the aircraft. But as Rachel taxied back to the parking area at Nellis, she could see that something had changed. On the ground, a cluster of official vehicles surrounded the flight line, including several black SUVs that screamed federal bureaucracy. Colonel Hayes met her at the aircraft, but her expression was grim. "Rachel, we have a problem. Word of the mission leaked to the Pentagon before we could control the narrative. There are some people here who aren't happy about a civilian pilot conducting a classified rescue operation." As Rachel climbed down from the cockpit, she could see the group of officials approaching. At their head was a stern-faced man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never been within 100 miles of a military aircraft. "Ms. Anderson," the man called out as he approached, his tone sharp with authority. "I'm Deputy Secretary Morrison from the Department of Defense. We need to talk." Rachel removed her helmet and straightened her flight suit, feeling the weight of the successful mission behind her and the bureaucratic storm ahead. "What can I do for you, sir?" "You can start by explaining why you thought it was appropriate to conduct an unauthorized military operation using a civilian aircraft in violation of approximately 17 different federal regulations." Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "Sir, the mission was fully authorized by Base Command under emergency rescue protocols. Ms. Anderson's participation was requested, specifically because she happens to be related to someone with a military record." Morrison cut her off. "That doesn't give her the authority to commandeer Air Force operations or endanger classified techniques." Rachel felt anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "With respect, Mr. Morrison, I didn't commandeer anything. I was asked to help save 4 lives using an aircraft I own and skills I've trained for. The mission was successful with 0 casualties and no equipment damage. The mission was a publicity stunt that compromised operational security," Morrison shot back. "Protocol Roar is a classified technique that requires proper military authorization to implement. You had no business attempting that level of tactical operation." "I had every business," Rachel replied, her voice growing harder. "Those were real people in real danger, and I was the only pilot available who could execute the required flight profile. Would you prefer I let them die while we sorted out paperwork?" Morrison's face reddened. "I would prefer that military operations be conducted by military personnel according to established chain of command procedures. What you did today was reckless grandstanding that puts future operations at risk." "What she did today," came a new voice from behind the group, "was exactly what Protocol Roar was designed for." Everyone turned to see Major General Patricia Thornton approaching, her uniform crisp and her expression indicating that she'd heard enough of the conversation to form strong opinions about it. "General," Morrison began, but Thornton cut him off with a gesture. Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, you're out of your depth here. Protocol ROAR exists specifically for situations where conventional rescue operations are impossible and time constraints make normal authorization procedures impractical. Ms. Anderson executed the protocol flawlessly under exactly the circumstances it was created for. Morrison's jaw tightened. General, the fact remains that a civilian conducted a classified military operation without proper oversight. The precedent this sets is unacceptable. The precedent this sets, General Thornton replied, is that the Air Force honors its commitments to bring everyone home, regardless of bureaucratic convenience. Ms. Anderson saved 4 lives today using techniques developed by her father specifically for this purpose. The aircraft she flew was restored to military specifications and performed exactly as intended. Rachel watched the confrontation unfold, realizing that this wasn't really about her or the mission. This was about 2 different philosophies of military operation, one that prioritized rules and procedures, and one that prioritized results and lives saved. Furthermore, General Thornton continued, I've reviewed the mission parameters and Ms. Anderson's performance. Her execution of Protocol ROAR was textbook perfect. If anything, this mission validates the continued relevance of the technique and suggests we should be training more pilots in its implementation. Morrison looked around the group, clearly realizing he was outnumbered but unwilling to back down. This discussion isn't over. The Pentagon will be reviewing this entire situation, and there will be consequences for the procedural violations that occurred here today. He turned and stalked back toward his vehicle, followed by his entourage of bureaucrats and policymakers. The black SUVs departed in a convoy of wounded dignity and frustrated authority. General Thornton watched them go, then turned to Rachel with a slight smile. Ms. Anderson, in 30 years of military service, I've learned that there are 2 kinds of people in this business. Those who follow procedures and those who save lives. Today, you save lives. Thank you, General. Don't thank me yet. Morrison wasn't wrong about one thing. This is going to generate a lot of attention from people who don't understand what Protocol ROAR means or why it matters. You may find yourself defending this decision for quite a while. Rachel looked back at the A-10, still bearing the tail number that had started this entire adventure. General, my father flew this aircraft into impossible situations because it was the right thing to do. He never asked for recognition or approval. He just did what needed to be done. If that's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. General Thornton nodded with satisfaction. Spoken like a true roar. Colonel Hayes, I want a full mission report on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. And I want recommendations for expanding Protocol ROAR training to our current pilot course. This technique is too valuable to keep locked away in classified files. As the officials dispersed and the flight line returned to normal operations, Rachel stood beside her father's aircraft and reflected on the day's events. She had proven that the A-10 could still perform miracles. That Protocol ROAR was more than just a historical footnote, and that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that break all the rules. The bureaucrats would file their reports and conduct their reviews, but 4 airmen were going home to their families tonight because a daughter had inherited her father's courage along with his aircraft. 3 months later, Rachel Anderson stood in a hangar at Nellis Air Force Base, watching a group of young pilots examine the A-10 Warthog that had become the centerpiece of the newly established Protocol ROAR training program. The aircraft bore the same tail number 880914, but now it also carried a small plaque beneath the cockpit that read, Canyon Hold Memorial Bird, David Anderson, Major, USAF, RET. First successful Protocol ROAR implementation. General Thornton approached, carrying a folder thick with official documents and commendations. The Pentagon review had concluded, and despite Deputy Secretary Morrison's objections, the mission had been not only vindicated but elevated to textbook status. The final report came through this morning, General Thornton said, handing Rachel the folder. Full validation of mission parameters and execution. You've been awarded the Civilian Medal for Exceptional Service, and the mission has been designated as Protocol Roar Training Standard Number 1. Rachel opened the folder, scanning pages of technical analysis and official praise. But what caught her attention was a handwritten note at the bottom of the final page. Some traditions are worth preserving, regardless of bureaucratic convenience. Thank you for reminding us why we do this job. General Patricia Thornton. There's something else, General Thornton continued. We'd like to offer you a position as civilian contractor for the Protocol Roar training program. Full access to military aircraft, instructor authorization, and the opportunity to teach other pilots the techniques your father pioneered. Rachel looked at the young pilots gathered around the Warthog, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that came from learning about something genuinely important. One of them, a lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 25, was running his hand along the fuselage with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. What did my father say when you offered him something similar 25 years ago? Rachel asked. General Thornton smiled. He said no. Said he'd done his part and wanted to go home and teach people to fly for the right reasons. But he also said that if his techniques ever needed to be passed on, we should find someone who understood what the aircraft was really capable of. And you think that's me? I think that's exactly what today proved. Rachel walked over to the group of pilots, listening as their instructor, Colonel Hayes, who had requested the training assignments, specifically explained the technical requirements for canyon navigation and precision extraction techniques. The key thing to understand, Hayes was saying, is that Protocol Roar isn't just about flying skills. It's about making decisions under impossible circumstances and accepting responsibility for outcomes that seem beyond your control. It's about saying yes when everyone else says no. One of the young pilots raised his hand. Colonel, is it true that only 2 pilots have ever successfully executed Protocol Roar extractions? As of 3 months ago, yes. Major David Anderson in 2000 and his daughter Rachel Anderson earlier this year. Both flying the same aircraft, both proving that some problems require solutions that exist outside normal parameters. The pilot looked over at Rachel, recognition dawning in his expression. Ma'am, are you really going to be teaching this program? Rachel looked at General Thornton, then back at the eager faces of the pilots who would carry this knowledge forward into whatever impossible situations awaited them. She thought about her father, quietly teaching flying lessons in Phoenix, probably watching the news coverage of her mission with the same mixture of pride and worry he'd shown throughout her aviation career. Lieutenant, she said finally, my father spent 25 years keeping quiet about something extraordinary he'd accomplished because he believed that heroes don't need recognition. They just need to be ready when they're needed. This program isn't about creating heroes. It's about making sure the knowledge exists to save lives when conventional options fail. She gestured toward the A-10, its warm paint and battle-tested systems looking almost humble next to the sleek modern fighters in adjacent hangars. This aircraft taught me that sometimes the old ways are the best ways, that reliability matters more than technology, and that the most important missions are usually the ones nobody wants to attempt. If you're serious about learning Protocol Roar, you'll need to understand that it's not just a flying technique. It's a commitment to bringing everyone home, no matter how impossible it seems. The pilots nodded with the solemnity of people who understood they were being offered something genuinely valuable and rare. General Thornton stepped forward. Ms. Anderson, do we have your answer? Rachel looked one more time at the tail number that had started this entire journey 880,914, the sequence of digits that had unlocked a family legacy she'd never known existed. Her father had pioneered something remarkable and then tried to forget about it. But some things were too important to forget, too valuable to bury in classified files and bureaucratic procedures. General, I accept the position, but I have one condition. Name it. When these pilots graduate from the program, they get to fly real missions using protocol ROAR techniques. No simulations, no training exercises. The whole point of this program is to have capable pilots ready when real people need real rescues. If we're not willing to use what we teach, then we're not really teaching anything meaningful. General Thornton extended her hand. Agreed. Welcome to the team, Instructor Anderson. As they shook hands, Rachel heard the sound of jets launching. From nearby runways, the daily business of military aviation continuing around them. But here in this hangar, with an old A-10 and a group of young pilots eager to learn impossible things, something else was continuing too. A tradition of saying yes to the impossible. A legacy of bringing everyone home, and the knowledge that some aircraft and some families are built for miracles. 6 months later, when a cargo plane went down in the mountains of Afghanistan and conventional rescue was deemed impossible, 4 graduates of the Protocol ROAR program successfully extracted all 7 crew members using techniques developed by Major David Anderson and validated by his daughter Rachel. The missions didn't make the news. The pilots didn't seek recognition. But somewhere in Phoenix, an old man teaching flying lessons heard about the rescue and allowed himself a small smile, knowing that the work he'd tried to leave behind had found its way into capable hands. Some legacies, Rachel had learned, aren't meant to be forgotten. They're meant to be passed on, refined, and used to save lives when the impossible becomes necessary. The A-10 with tail number 880,914 still flies training missions at Nellis, still teaches young pilots that limits exist to be exceeded, and still carries the memory of a canyon where heroes are made and everyone comes home. Because some aircraft and some traditions are built to last forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.